The American Dream. 2.5 kids, nice job with great retirement benefits, and a house in the suburbs. Something that a lot of Americans see as impossible now. And while, yes, we've talked about why in a lot of episodes now, we haven't really talked about one of the most notable parts of it yet. The suburbs. The burbs. The place that all the teenagers in 90s movies hated, and the place that all the early 2000s kids wish they grew up in. Place that boomers imagine as America's heartland, and where their kids first tried crystal meth in their friend Tommy's backyard. And also, falling apart and being eaten alive by the American city. Well, maybe. Or, hey, maybe it's not even real. We talk about it today on Why Aren't You Talking About This? Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Waytat. I'm your host, William, and I will be your guide through the very, very domesticated world of suburbs today. Coming at you from the suburb. Maybe. I don't know, because the research for this episode has turned me into one of those, transvestigators, except for neighborhoods. I mean, once I saw the definition of suburb, I started seeing them everywhere, and I can't be sure where is and where isn't a suburb. Which has been really confusing because I really want to jerk off to them, but I don't want anyone to think that I'm into suburbs. Anyways, I want to thank you so much for choosing to listen to my show over any other option. It means the world to me to have the sound of my voice breaking your suburban peace like the release of any rap album since 1981. Although off script for a second, it feels very nice to be back recording. I feel like every 3 weeks is healthier for me, but oh man, do I miss the sitting down to record part of this. But anyways, unlike last time, we don't really have any emails or updates. I do just want to apologize real quick to anyone hanging around on YouTube. I have intermittently forgot about you. But overall, I mean, Daddy has just gotten no ideas for the fireside chats, and I don't know what to talk about next. I started this script the Saturday or Sunday before the Friday before you're hearing this. I still don't know. I've been racking my brain for over 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do for the next fireside chat, and I have no idea. But also my cache got blasted, so I lost the wheel. So while I try to figure out some more topics, I'll probably be suspending those for a little while. And maybe, I'm not super sure. But if you want to get into contact, make sure to send me an email, a DM, or just comment. Also remember to like the show and leave a review, and anything else you can do. It helps out a whole lot. Oh, also, I just want to shout out real quick, Piper's Cafe. If you find yourself in Aloha, Oregon, or Aloha, I don't know, we pronounce things weird in Oregon, make sure to check out her cafe. No need to say I sent you. I didn't even ask her if I could shout her out. But actually it's probably better if you don't say that I sent you, because, oh man, I don't want her perception of me dropping to awful. But anyways, she just opened up recently after working extremely hard, and she makes really good coffee. But with that, let's go to the show. So, like normal, we're going to start off defining what a suburb even is. And put simply, It's an outlying district or town connected to a larger city, especially one that's focused on residential lots and housing. They have a much lower population density than cities and are either part of the urban city environment or are an entirely different town within commuting distance. They have a lot of daytime economic action and job activity, and are also hubs of a lot of small amounts of money changing hands. Now, if you're going, that sounds like where I live, then good job. You're already on my descent to madness. Add to that, while they're often their own legal entity in the US, that isn't the case in Europe, being seen as an extension of the city they're attached to. Suburban areas tend to have more availability of and access to playgrounds and sports fields, public swimming pools and waterways, nature parks and greenways, trails and bikeways, as well as having better options for walking, biking, and bus riding than either cities or rural areas, which again is starting to sound a lot like a lot of places, right? Well, let's add in the factor of suburban sprawl, which is basically how suburbs spread like mold on a very old piece of bread or your grandpa's butt crack that hasn't seen light or fresh air since Reagan was in office. And that was only for college hazing. Suburban Suburban sprawls are areas of low developmental density, filled with homes, shops, and workplaces. They're all separated and with space between them. Which, that might sound like a dream, but this instead wastes a lot of space and also causes a severe lack of activity centers, plazas, city centers, or central squares, and also entirely removes having a downtown. Not to mention that it causes poor street connectivity and dead ends galore. Which, as you can imagine, leads to increased obesity, traffic accidents, commuting distance and time, and also emergency response times from, all the traffic and also not walking very much. It also causes reduced physical activity, air quality, and worsening social interaction for the same reason. And if you're thinking of where you live right now, yeah, you're right. But then think about where you grew up, where you work, where you go for fun. Yeah, that could all fit into the definition of a suburb. But, okay, that's all fine and good. But, was Johnny Law say? Well, nothing. Fucking not a goddamn thing. There's no federal definition of a suburb, and every country in the world, every state in the US, every county, and even individual cities define it themselves. If they even care to. There's a lot of places in the US that don't even give enough of a shit to define a suburb, which is not helpful, especially for this episode. Even the American Communities Project, a group that specifically looks at shit like this, don't have a single definition. However, helpfully for us, they do have categories of suburb. Because according to them, suburbs aren't just like a singular type of community, and there's some nuance between the types. The first they have listed are suburban suburbs, which are suburbs cosplaying as urban areas, like when white kids from Malibu pretend they're from Compton. But these are areas with high population densities, accounting for around 70.8 million people nationwide across 112 counties. They also have a pretty high income, around $87K a year, and at least 42% have a bachelor's degree or greater. They're also pretty racially and ethnically diverse, and they tend to lean left. The second are called middle suburbs, which exist a lot in the Northeast. And these are set up around large metro areas that were initially meant to house manufacturing laborers, and now house about 12.2 million people across 57 counties. While initially fairly diverse for suburbs, at least, we'll get back to that later, they've shifted in demographics, being largely white with a few degrees, 27% with a bachelor's or higher, and most are right-wing. They also still make a good amount of money, about $64K a year. Then we have exurbs, which are the suburbs placed just on the edge of being rural. These are places where you can only hear every other note of dueling banjos. They have very low density, being 196 counties, but only accounting for 31.2 million people, and also have very low diversity. However, income tends to be a bit better than the middle suburbs, and they also have more degrees. They also contain a lot of families that move away from cities for larger land plots and bigger houses. I mean, in general, unsurprisingly, they're about as far right as the middle suburbs. And finally, we have the big city suburbs, which are basically right on the doorstep of the city they're attached to. These are within only 48 counties and have 81.2 million people, making them the most densely populated out of all suburbs. They're also highly diverse and well educated with low levels of segregated facilities, which is a thing that still kind of happens, actually. The Civil Rights Act didn't magically fix everything. Read a fucking book. Their housing costs are also massively higher than other suburbs, and they tend to lean left politically, with 66% of their population voting blue pretty consistently. But we're really only scratching the surface of what suburbs really are. I mean, ultimately, to get a handle on them, we can say, you'll know when you see it, which is very frustrating to a brain that works like mine. Because my brain sees that and thinks, well, fuck, what isn't a suburb? Because, like, half of all human settlements you could stretch that definition over. But okay, so that's kind of what a suburb is. So then what's the big deal? Well, to address that, let's talk about the pros and cons of the burbs. Starting with the cons, because that's kind of the format of the show and also what we're doing here. Sorry to pull the curtain back on you a little bit, but yeah, this is all planned. Vaguely. So, firstly, is that suburbs have a fuckload of traffic and congestion. Because they're so spread out and often built to accommodate cars, that's almost impossible to travel through them without a car. On top of that, because a lot of people commute from their suburb, they spend a lot of time in traffic at predictable times of day, like morning, noon, and evening rushes. And this causes about 51 hours of congestion and $869 dollars per year of lost time. Oh, per person, sorry. Secondly, because of, again, also I just want to pause on that for a second. Holy shit, that's a lot of fucking money when you, like, extrapolate that out to, like, even some of the least densely populated suburbs. That's fucking insane. But anyways, secondly, because of, again, the space that they take up, combined with dependency on vehicles, fewer people per structure, and the massive fucking travesty that yards are, suburbs have a massive environmental impact. They suck power out of the power grid, like your waifu sucks my woman's titties, very hard and for long periods of the day, to heat, cool, and light homes that people aren't even spending a lot of their time in. And they also produce a ton of emissions that all their vehicles and whatever fucking contraptions they bought on Amazon today are causing. Added to them killing off native plant life and starving pollinators to plant literal miles of nothing but boring, bitch-ass basic grass. Not even like local grasses, they import the fucking grass. Have you noticed that every suburb's grass is literally the fucking same? Yeah, that's because they kill native grass to plant new grass so you can look like you're from a suburb on the East Coast, so you can look like you're from a suburb in England. Ugh. But beyond the environment, they also suck socially. Because suburbs are very insular communities, which actually makes things like racism a massive fucking problem in the suburbs, because everyone there is super concerned about safety and preserving the sanctity of their suburb. They see anyone who doesn't look like them, act like them, or sound like them as a threat to that. And since most suburbs are either white or white passing, this means that a lot of people of color are locked out even to the modern day. Add on to that, because of a lot of HOAs, which, fuck HOAs by the way, they're the devil, neighborhood watches and suburbanites are allowing... Add on to that, but because a lot of HOAs, which fuck HOAs by the way, they're the devil, neighborhood watches and suburbanites, being allowed to have racist policies and also routinely have racist outbursts, and even have the power to evict people, this makes owning property while not being white even harder, even ignoring this social isolation from being surrounded by racist white people, which creates massive gaps in home ownership, space and freedom, and generational wealth. Also, I apologize for the train in the background. The train is very pissed that I'm outing suburbs like this. But that's all the big social stuff. What about, like, personal problems? How does it affect me as a person? Well, there's some pretty big glaring negatives. First, you need to have a car. It's literally impossible to traverse the burbs without one. Because everyone wants their own space, and a lot of it, suburbs don't really have businesses tightly packed and aren't usually very walkable and available don't have reliably available public transit. Second, jobs are rarer. Since there are fewer since there's few commercial areas or office jobs, and most of the places available to work are daytime service industry jobs paying minimum wage or small businesses with small and insular staff, finding a job in the suburbs is really hard, much less a job that can support your rent or mortgage, which again means commuting. But more than that, it also means you can't really move to a suburb without either having a job lined up or a well paying one in the nearby city. Also, suburbs are boring as shit. The nightlife is ass, there aren't a lot of restaurants, and a lot of them close early. And if you like living a busy, fast paced life, full of things to see and people to do, suburbs are just an awful choice. Because again, this is where people live, not where they have fun. They have fun on vacation. This is just where their meat suit sleeps for them to go to work tomorrow. Also, suburbs have a lot more space to fill, which might not sound that bad, but if you've been living in an apartment where space comes at a premium, you want to maximize your space efficiency because you care about the financial implications, environmental implications, or you're autistic, or you don't really like keeping a lot around, it's going to be hard to fill that space if you've never had it before. Or, hell, maintaining it. And finally, is just in general, there's fewer amenities. Unless you like to go outside or get really involved in the community. But let's face it, you're listening to me, so you're borderline violently antisocial anyways. But that isn't to say that suburbs are all bad. In fact, more than almost any other episode so far, this episode isn't nearly as hostile or about something nearly as problematic. Suburbs can be chill. So let's set down the pitchforks and talk about the good sides. So, firstly, it gives you a lot of space and privacy for lower costs than your average urban space. Meaning that if you're a private person, need or want a lot of space, or you have a family, it's a better deal financially than an apartment of adequate size. Of course, bigger upfront costs, but if you're able to afford it, suburbs are great. Related to this is that suburbs overall are better value for your money. You have a lot more greenery available to you and a space to call your own, as well as things like washers and dryers and big kitchens with actual ovens. So you're also saving quite a bit of money because you're not needing to rely on laundromats, paid parking, and eating out nearly as often. Also, suburban schools are a lot better than urban ones. And not only for racist reasons this time. Because people in suburbs generally have more degrees, make more money, and have a bigger focus on either community or looking good. They don't want shit schools in the area and have the actual time and resources to slapbox school administrators in the Dairy Queen parking lot over it. I'm hoping that's a national reference, not just like a weird local reference that I'm pulling out of nowhere. Added to that is that there's fewer students with more gross tax dollars going into the school. The school system in general has better resources. And there's also more opportunities for hobbies, clubs, and sports that can help you out a lot in life. People are also a lot more engaged with their community in suburbs, which creates more interconnectedness. Now, for me, this sounds like a nightmare, especially because I've seen how some of you motherfuckers can get. But there's also a lot more local events and festivals, which is actually pretty neat. Relatedly, suburbs are better places for families. Because they're usually slower with more space, with tight communities that are more geared towards family after decades of propaganda and advertising. Sorry, I said propaganda twice. Kids tend to be nominally safer and less likely to fuck up so hard they die than in urban environments. It's hard to run out of traffic when you can play in the yard instead of having to play on the sidewalk. I say that toddlers don't actively try to kill themselves, but suburbs, also because there's fewer people, tend to have a much lower crime rate and also higher levels of cleanliness and maintenance done on them. Also, this is for racist reasons too. We can't really ignore that in talking about this. Racism is definitely a big part of why suburbs get a lot of attention, but also these places usually have their own emergency services, even if they're small, meaning you have more police and firefighters per capita. So, socially, it's just a lot calmer, safer, more spacious. But on personal levels, there's of course more benefits, like bigger homes for less money. Again, if you can afford the down payment, mortgage payments tend to be noticeably cheaper than rent. Also, the environment is a lot cleaner and more peaceful. Homes tend to be grouped together away from industrial and commercial areas, creating some peace and quiet, and also distancing yourself from the pollution caused by those industries, including light pollution, sound pollution, and some traffic. And these environments also give you plenty of opportunities to meet your neighbors while also giving you privacy to act as a shield to get away from them. Yeah, and for its dream. Now, because of all that extra space, you have room to spread out and adopt hobbies that take up some time, you give your pets and kids more room, and you have space for stuff like an office or a workshop. And finally, of course, since everything moves at a slower pace, you aren't beholden to a fast-paced lifestyle if you hate it. And because there's not really a rush to get to public transit stations or to find parking, you can afford to move at a slower pace. Which, sure, sounds all nice and good, and to those of you who see the suburbs as a distillation of everything wrong with capitalism, I can sense you shaking in your panties in pure rage. Don't worry, we're going to talk about the problems. And the best way to address those is to talk about how and why suburbs happen to begin with. And for that, let's go to the history section. And we begin way back in the ancient days. And no, this isn't a joke. But how ancient are we going? Well, so ancient that some of the most powerful cultures in the world were filled with women with their titties out and men with their nutsack getting breeze cooled. Yep, those goddamn Greeks and Egyptians. So in the ancient days, suburbs, as we call them now, sprung up organically around cities to support them with things you needed to be more rural, for like food production, but also at the same time reap some benefits from the city, like having a commercial center, a garrison, and hookers. In fact, in ancient Rome, the word suburbani was first coined by Cicero to refer to Roman villas and estates built by wealthy Romans so they could feel like kings and queens while also avoiding the monumentally dangerous, labyrinthine, unlit roads of Rome. In China, during the Han Dynasty, which is between 25 AD and 190 AD, if I got my dates right, towards the end of the period, Dong Zhao razed the capital city Luoyang, and then kicked out all the commoners and forced them to move into nearby towns and cities that supported the city while he and his supporters lived in it. And in a way, this is kind of a suburb, but it's important to this history, not because it's technically a suburb, but because this kind of settlement really caught on in China, having a city center filled with rich and important people and oust everyone else to the countryside. But from there, we jump all the way to the medieval period. Because from these beginnings, there wasn't much of a change. In the East, cities were for the rich and the country for the poor. While in the West, it was kind of the opposite, with the rich living in isolated villas and working within the cities when they had to. In the Middle Ages, people across the countryside, across the world, started moving into cities more and more for the opportunities and security they provided. And as these grew and absorbed other settlements, technically suburbs were created in much the same way suburbs are sometimes created now. But now we hyperfixate on England because their history is really where we in America get our suburbs from. So, beginning in the late 1700s, as poor people moved into London and surrounding cities, the middle class and rich, not wanting to be touched by those filthy fucking poors, moved in the countryside in lavish estates and often took their servants with them, who would then live in small little neighborhoods like in the Middle Ages. And this resulted in a trend that would develop into suburbs going into the 19th century, where cities like London began to grow rapidly, with suburbs and estates springing up around the urban centers away from those disgusting brokies, but close to the convenience of cities, helped out massively by railroads. Meanwhile, in their Australian colony, suburbs cropped up at around the same time and gave rise to the popular Australian-style suburb, which is a fancy way of saying a house on a quarter acre of land. Where I live is actually an Australian-style suburb. Um, Compared to an American-style suburb, which is a lot denser. And this developed into the Australian dream by the mid-19th century, when the first major suburbs around London started to become overcrowded and increasingly unhealthy and unsanitary. Joke's on you, rich assholes. Joke's on you, rich assholes. You can't escape the unwashed hordes. To address this, the UK built railroads in the 1860s, connecting London, Middlesex, nice, and Harrow, or Harrow. It's harrowing to... Never mind, that's a dumb pun. Together, and allowing for the rich people to once again move further out to avoid the brokies. And since a lot of suburbs can now be commuted to by the end of the 19th century, it opened up these places to the middle class. No less disgusting than the poor, but more civilized about it. Into the beginning of the 20th century, as a bid to protect historical land from being overdeveloped, Henrietta Barnett and her husband bid to have Hampstead Heath be established as a suburb, which worked, and to this day, the Hampstead Heath is public parkland attached to the nearby Hampstead suburb. In 1912, the UK begins talks to allow for private companies to take over control of land under control of the Surplus Lands Committee to build more suburbs and add developments. However, this gets shelved because of World War I, which, as you might imagine, was an odd name for the conflict at the time. During the war, the Tudor-Walters Committee was asked to take a look at Britain's whole housing situation and make recommendations for how to rebuild after the war and build new homes. And what they discovered, shocks of all shocks, is that living in empty crayon boxes and mud huts wasn't good. Kinda kidding. They found that the reason for a lot of recruits, especially later in the war, being in such shit health was because of just the god-awful living conditions they grew up in. So in 1919, after the war, to fix this, the British government passed the Housing, Town Planning, and I could not find, I assume that means an and etc. Act, which allowed for building new suburbs and estates across the nation and introduced a bunch of new regulatory measures and standards for suburban construction. Stuff like maximum housing density, arrangement, and design. Also in 1919, because of the post-war housing boom, the Metropolitan Railway County Estates Limited, fucking British names, I swear to God, is formed and develops estates through the 20s and 30s. Speaking of which, during the interwar period, suburbs greatly expanded and became covered in greenery and gardens because of the Garden City movement, which is actually something we talked about in the land management episode. But by the 1930s, the UK and much of Europe contained a ton of expanding suburbs, with the UK alone building 4 million houses in a single decade. And with that, we're actually going to pick back up in 1932 with the US timeline. I know, it's been a while since you've seen one of those, isn't it? I guess technically heard. But anyways, we begin in 1932, when 250,000 properties are lost in foreclosure. And a year and a half later, the majority of mortgages would go into default. Also in 1933, as part of the New Deal program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation started to buy and refinance on existing mortgages. And if you're worried and having 2008 flashbacks, don't worry, it was actually the government. Which I know doesn't really assuage your fears, but this was when the government wasn't actively trying to implode. Also, they changed the payback period to 15 years rather than 5, allowing people to once again buy homes. To the point that the Hulk owned about 1/5 of all mortgages in the US, and a lot of people owned their house outright. Also beginning in 1933, the FHA began to protect lenders from defaulting on their mortgage, allowing people to afford their loans earlier. 6 years later, as part of the New Deal again, real estate appraisers arrive in Pasadena, California to evaluate building conditions. And as of the Hulk and FHA policies, a lot of these buildings need to be repaired. But they weren't. And why was that? Well, because the appraisers evaluated that the residents of these homes would likely not see any benefit, seeing as they would just fall back into disrepair. Now, is this because of some weird rot vortex over Pasadena? As much as you might think so, no. It's because the appraisers were racist and the owners were black. And this is the beginning of the incredibly long American history of suburban racial discrimination. And this behavior was echoed across the country, with people whose job it was to repair and update buildings only doing it for white people because they'd quote unquote do better at maintaining it and appreciate the effort. Which is like, I don't know, that's like a level of dumb racism that is just like hard to even like say anything against because it's just so fucking stupid, you know? Anyways, putting that on the back burner for a second and jumping into World War II, the American way. America pushes itself out of the Great Depression through sheer economic brute force, selling weapons and equipment to the Allies before eventually joining the war effort. And afterwards, we continue to spend massively, subsidizing and giving massive loans for veterans, research and science, infrastructure, and business. Beginning in '44 with the GI Bill, which amongst other things gave veterans a housing loan. However, a lot of banks refuse to take these loans from people of color, despite them qualifying in a practice called redlining. This is basically when white people are allowed to settle places, i.e. suburbs, and force people of color into cities. 2 years later, the first American prototype suburb is constructed, called Leviton, after the builder William Levitt in Long Island, which became quickly filled with World War II vets, which, as you can imagine, is a bit scary to try to do some like out-of-neighborhood crime in, or to try to invade. Another 2 years later, the Supreme Court rules redlining unconstitutional and calls the owning of private property and access to housing as not just human rights, but American rights, which is the thing that Americans care about more, regardless of skin color. Which helps to build the fire under the brewing civil rights movement, but doesn't actually stop the process of redlining. In 1950, credit cards are first introduced largely because of suburban wealth. And in the same year, residential washing machines, dryers, refrigerators, freezers, TVs, and cars sell exponentially more and new models are shot at the factories drawing Mozart. If you get that joke, good taste. By 1964, those FHA and Hulk loans mentioned earlier skyrocket home ownership to 62%, while suburb populations rose to 30.7% of all Americans. And this is like some prime American dream time, with a lot of people believing all it takes to be successful is a diploma, a nice suit, and a brain. Oh, and white skin, but back then they did not say the quiet part out loud. Into the 60s in general, real estate investment trusts, investment banks, major pension and insurance funds, and corporations invested a ton of money into urban and metropolitan real estate. At the same time, federal and local deregulation occurred. And this match made an ennui hell cause massive real estate development and bulldozing hundreds of miles of land to build new suburbs in a massive new suburban sprawl. But there is some good news. Because in the 60s, due to the passing of the Hart-Celler Act, Civil Rights Act, and Fair Housing Act, improved the prospects of minorities and reduced housing discrimination overall. I mean, a little bit. The racists just got a little bit more clever about being incredibly, unbelievably racist, but yeah, you can't just like legally tell a black person, no, I'm not letting you buy this house because fuck you, I'm racist. Now we get to the 1970s, and almost the end of the timeline. I know, sad, right? But the 70s begins the boom and bust cycle of real estate, with record-setting numbers of housing developments in 71, 72, and 73, and then a massive market collapse in 74, which happens almost like clockwork at least once a decade. You know, like the early 80s, early 90s, late 2000s, mid 2010s, and Well, shit, sounds like it's about time to get out of real estate. I'd shout for the people that I know to get out of there, but they have AirPods in, and also I don't like super care. Let's be real. I mean, what can I say? I'm a fucking leftist. Anyways, this creates a cycle where a housing market fucking skyrockets and becomes the easiest way to become a multi-billionaire, and then crashes in the earth so deep it taint tickles the earth's core, bankrupts about 3 billionaires we pretend to be sad about, 100 million poor people that we absolutely don't pretend to be sad about, and destroys the entire economy for about 5 years. Why exactly this happens, I can't fucking tell you, besides we're stupid, and economists are still working on that one and won't just accept my answer of we're stupid, no matter how many bricks I throw through their window. But anyways, the 70s also brings us a massive diversification of the suburbs, both culturally and stylistically. And a big reason for this is because the suburbs have been around for conservatively like 30 to 40 fucking years, meaning that some of the older vets and rich people that bought houses are starting to die or sell their properties, allowing people to move in easier, including people of color, the divorced, single, queer, and the people who don't even have a family or partner. You know, all the people your grandma was taught to hate as a child. Also in 1976, the geographer Peter Muller calls suburbs the essence or heart of American cities rather than actual urban areas in a study where he points out that not only do more people live in suburbs, but there's also more jobs there. But before we leave this timeline, the age of the suburb is upon us. Kinda. The classic suburbs from the 50s and 60s dies in the 70s and 80s. Due to a changing economy, the suburbs fall apart and quickly become just another part of the urban/suburban sprawl. The middle class began to shrink, industry moves overseas, and older suburbs become abandoned to just fall apart, with only a few old people left alive to wait to go to that big, beautiful 1950s suburb in the sky. And on that sad and or happy note, depending on your political alignment, let's go to the current day. Alright, so now that we have all of that covered, we can answer why suburbs happen. Legislation like the New Deal program, the Federal Housing Administration creating jobs and building cheap housing, and other programs meant to spread the sprawl. And also with manufactured homes that can snap into place in the neighborhoods, we get easily spread suburbs. Also housing demand, because of the American dream, a lot of money gets put into building massive suburbs. And finally, our reliance on cars lets suburbs continue to be built and why we keep using them. But let's talk about the kinds of people that live in suburbs and some differences between them and the people who live in urban and rural environments. Beginning with some of the basic demos. And first, race. And because the primary difference is white and people of color, we're just going to do that. In urban environments, the population is 56% non-white, which is the highest across all three environments. In suburban areas, 68% of the population is white, while a staggering 79% of rural populations are white. Now we also have the population size demo. Firstly, urban areas have grown by 13%, and suburban areas have grown by 16% since the year 2000, while rural areas have grown by only 3%. But these populations have also been aging pretty hard, with 26% more people in urban areas over 65, and that's true for a fucking wild 39% of suburbs and 22% rural. Which really shows that suburbs are kind of dying because the people who can afford it are reaching ages where they very well might just start dying off. Grim, I know, but hey, it's the truth. Especially when you consider that most suburban residents are long-term residents, with 53% of all suburbanites having lived there for over a decade, which while less than the 63% of rural people that have done the same, is a much greater number than the 45% of suburbanites who've lived in the city for over a decade. Combining these together means that these communities are going to largely be losing their long-term residents, which while obviously calling suburban cultures unique and precious is absurd, does mean that the weird cultural stank they added to the place is going to get scrubbed clean, along with whatever made the place ever so slightly unique. Also, for all Americans, about 41% of Americans have either always lived or currently live where they grew up, meaning that yes, while you could just move, and honestly, it's good for you to see the world, this is something that you need to actually consider to get a better picture of your average modern suburbanite. It's not some dude that served his country and came here for a quiet life. No, Grandpa did that. He just inherited Grandpa's house from his parents, who inherited it from his grandpa. Also, poverty rates in suburbs are climbing sharply. From the year 2000 to 2016, suburban poverty jumped up 53% compared to 33% for both urban and rural environments. Now, is it troubling that poverty rates are increasing across the board? Yes. Yes, it is. But is it something that's given special importance in suburbs because for so long we've associated suburbs with Americana? Yes. Yes, it is. But before we get to what the people in these places think, we should also mind the politics. Of left-leaners, 62% are urbanites, 47% are suburban, and 38% are rural. And for the right, 31% are from urban places, 45% are from the burbs, and 54% are rural. And with those stats, your vision of what these places are like should be becoming clear. Cities have become the place for left-leaning, transitory people with higher levels of diversity and who tend to be younger with a more disposable income, while the suburbs are dying, sprawling places filled with mostly centrists who live there for generations, whose wealth is largely beginning to dry up. And quickly. So then let's talk about some attitudes. Firstly, do these places value diversity? Well, as you might imagine, urban residents say that ethnic diversity is at least somewhat important, about 70% of the time. Equally unsurprising is that rural residents see diversity as important only 53% of the time. Of course, putting two and two together, suburbs fall in the middle at 59%, which I think is skewed. Why? Well, because redlining, shithead HOAs and neighborhood watches, and all the other racist shit that contributes to the suburbs not being diverse has unsurprisingly, but unfortunately, made them pretty racist. And unfortunately, this might not change until the aging population dies and new people can move in. Because 37% of urban residents, 25% of rural residents, and 34% of suburban residents would choose to move. And of those populations, 41% of the urban population would want to move to the suburb. Only 28% would willingly go to another city, and only 30% would go to a rural area. I can't say I blame them. I live right on the edge of suburban and rural, and let me tell you, living rural fucking sucks cock and balls if you're used to cities. And this is important because even out of the people who live in suburbs, 41% would just move to a different suburb. Only 23% would go to a city, and 35% would consider a countryside exodus. Which, let me tell you, the rural people don't want you. If they could, they would shoot you. Like, if they could legally get away with it, they'd kill you. While rural people are pretty likely to go to the suburbs at 39% or stay rural at 40%. So unless that aging suburban population dies out and urbanites move in to take their place, suburbs are unfortunately going to stay pretty dicey racially. Of course, this has some extra problems attached to it because most people feel pretty attached to the community. 17% of urban residents feel very attached to the community, 1% higher than average, while suburbanites feel somewhat attached 44% of the time. Again, 1% higher than average. Meaning that comparing attachments, 70% of the people in the suburbs and urban areas are pretty attached to where they already are. So, again, the odds of someone moving by choice is actually pretty small. And probably adding to not only that, but stratification and tribalism between these community types is that they think the other communities don't understand their issues and think other places have vastly different issues. Like rural residents, for example. 70% don't think that people understand the issues they face. 59% think that urban people have different values than they do. Compared to 53% urban, compared to 53% suburban, and 73% rural with the same. Urban residents think similarly, 65% saying others don't understand them, with the same proportion seeing urbanites as having the same values, and suburbanites more often than not having the same values, but that rural people, by the same proportion, have different values, at around 53%. And these suburbs actually are the most agreeable, with just under or over 50% having the same values, and just under knowing the problems that they face. Also, I will say, real quick, that's all just fucking wrong. Not like that, like, I just pulled, like, garbage out of my ass. No, like, for the most part, people are people. They understand the problems you're going through. Because most people have the same problems. Like, there's only so many permutations of the same problems that you can have that's unique. And, like, yeah, no, these communities share most of the same problems. It's just, like, small little facets of it. But, okay. This episode is about the burbs. So let's refocus and revisit that pros and cons list. Unlike other episodes, we aren't really talking about something in dire need of fixing. But that if we don't do something soon, these cons are going to become really big issues. So how do we combat suburban sprawl while negating some of these bad things about suburbs and create better equality and equity in these communities? Well, we need to redesign the suburbs. Which, hey, that's not too big of an ask right now. We're constantly building new ones, and with the older ones desperately needing some repairs anyways, only the grumpiest boomers are going to complain. And then what are they going to do about it? They're going to die into like 10 years. So, first of all, design your suburbs with nature in mind. Instead of just having a massive, flat, featureless plain like you're playing a city simulator on easy mode. Instead, let the natural landscape show through and in places even build around it and break up the monotony. This is good for the people, the community, and the environment. Good for the environment because obviously you're not face-fucking Mother Earth just because you can. It's also good for the people because, believe it or not, the human brain was not designed to deal with straight rows of concrete and vinyl siding as far as the eye can see. You literally need to touch grass for your brain and body to function properly, and your brain likes patterns, but patterns that are a little harder to figure out than 957 cement cubes sitting side by side. And this also gives the community a bit of identity. You can no longer plop someone in the middle of your suburb and let them think that they're in any other suburb on the entire fucking planet. Now, there's stuff that's unique to your area, and that helps to preserve its identity, and also makes your hometown a little distinct. Which, I will say, a lot of people that have, like, grown up in their hometowns for, like, 50 years, they appreciate that. They want their hometown to be known for something. Secondly, mix up the housing styles. Your suburb should have a bit of soul and feel like a place that people with identities and ideas live. Make different house sizes, floor plans, costs, and styles. That way you attract people of different tastes, careers, financial situations, and also gives your community something resembling a unique identity. And the other thing, too, is that you, as a developer, you don't necessarily need to do a whole lot for this. Make like 6 or 7 different house styles, floor plans, and styles, and you have just created about 120 to 210 different house designs, assuming everything can scale correctly. Third, also reuse your structures. Find new uses for old buildings rather than tearing them down or leaving them abandoned. Like, does your town have a massive fucking cathedral in the middle of it for no reason, despite the fact that no one for centuries has been Catholic in your area? Well, when you suburbanify it, don't tear that down for 8 generic-ass houses. Turn that into a community center or multi-purpose building. Or, hey, really piss Jesus off and turn that into a market. That'll add some identity and also decrease wastefulness, and also give a middle finger to God, which, suburbs already do. Another thing you can do is a big porch small yard, or garden over yard. Instead of wasting a fuck ton of water, creating a fuck ton of pollution, and causing a fuck ton of your boomer neighbors to judge you for something ultimately meaningless on having and meticulously maintaining a yard, something that, by the way, comes from showing off how rich you were in medieval England by having wasteland, turn the entire area into a garden or wild patch to support local biodiversity and pollinators. Or, if that's not your speed, which, I'll say is fair, gardens are a lot of work and are sometimes really temperamental and aggravate allergies like crazy. You could have a small yard and a big porch. So you can either host more people or have space to do whatever the hell you want outside while contending with the fucking grass and bugs and pollen in the air and probably dogs shitting in your yard and you stepping on it with your bare feet, Next, retrofit strip malls. turn these big, ugly, gray pieces of utter dog water into storefronts, main streets, walking and park squares, and community meeting areas. That is a much better use of them, considering that strip malls are starting to go the same way. They're much bigger, dumber cousin, the mall. And while we're at it, let's also destroy the cul-de-sac. Cul-de-sacs, if you don't know, are circular neighborhoods connected by a single street. And these places are fucking awful. There's a lot of wasted space with weird shaped yards. They also suck to get out of and cause a fuckload of traffic jams. Also, if you have a larger vehicle or have to tow something, or one of your neighbors has a larger vehicle or has to tow something, you're not leaving. It will take 20 fucking minutes to turn an SUV around in a cul-de-sac if everyone's parked on the street. Sorry, that's just me venting a little bit. One of my friends lives in a cul-de-sac, and I used to play D&D in a neighborhood that was a cul-de-sac, and oh my god, this fucking driving an SUV through a cul-de-sac is the worst possible thing. But yeah, just stop using the cul-de-sac design. For more ways to protect the land, the first thing is to protect agricultural land. It's a common thing for developers to buy agricultural land to build more suburbs. So, just stop doing that. And instead, if you can shove something more into the city or already existing suburbs, do that instead. Like, you probably don't need to buy that farmland to build a shopping center when you have a vacant building downtown. It's like eating your vegetables. You don't get to have the dessert of building a nice new fancy shopping center when you haven't done something with your vegetables, which is the abandoned shopping center that you need to fix. Also, plant some goddamn trees. They not only provide cleaner air, but they also muffle traffic noises, protect pedestrians by body blocking for them, offer weather cover and wind breaking, cool the streets, and reduce the ambient temperature of your suburbs by absorbing heat instead of the asphalt which reflects it, and are also just pretty nice to look at in general compared to just gray fucking wasteland. So, all benefits, and the only downside is that you need to pay for it. Oh, and also homeless people have something nice. I know Americans hate that, like, absolutely hate homeless people having anything nice, but, and if we're talking about helping pedestrians, narrow the streets. Offer more sidewalks, have corners that protrude into the road to protect pedestrians from, people just blasting through intersections, and make the streets smaller overall to reduce traffic by making walking safer and more convenient while also reducing speeding. For more things to just massively overhaul, add more corner stores. Corner stores let people walk to get snacks and some light groceries at a cheaper price. Again, reducing traffic and making suburbs more affordable. Also have some building diversity. Use the same building for more purposes. Saves a lot of power, space, and can condense non-residential parts of suburbs. Finally, think small. Make spaces a lot smaller. Smaller shops, smaller yards, smaller roads, smaller plots of land, and smaller schools. All this makes the space a lot more accessible and deals less damage to the environment and is a smaller resource sink than bigger areas. And there's also 3 final things we can do. First, provide public transit. Build more bike lanes, walkways, and bus stops so people don't rely on cars. Also, add greenery. More parks, community gardens, and outdoor spaces. That's a lot healthier for people, the environment, and also reduces allergies and makes people a lot happier. It reduces allergies by exposure therapy, by the way. Your body learns to freak out less about pollen when it's around pollen all the time. So, it's both a health and public order bonus. But the last thing to do is work on creating better diversity. Don't just do a fucking WASP center. Make sure that you're serving your community with offerings that support their culture and ethnic background. Also embrace and try to attract people that aren't WASPs to suburbs, because being exposed to more cultures and colors is good for everyone. And yes, by the way, this works. Literally the first step to solve racism in the suburbs is to have a taco stop that Mexican people actually like and a traditional Chinese restaurant staffed by people who are both Chinese and local, and then suddenly the white people aren't scared anymore. It's nice and comfortable through the door sniff test. Basically, if anything is true, it's that humans like you a lot more when you feed them. It really makes you question how much racism and xenophobia is allowed to persist, simply because it helps the powers that be maintain control over us, because we're more focused on the aesthetic differences of race creating culture rather than the actual things causing us normal people harm like poverty and pollution that the rich are milking for the sole purpose of more and more wealth while we struggle and kill each other over essentially Minecraft skins in real life. Oh, sorry, 1 second. The Department of Homeland Security is calling me. Okay, understood. Yeah, I won't do it again. Motherfuckers. Anyways, when I first wrote down this episode on the schedule, I thought I'd uncover some, massive grand problem going on in America's suburbs that's threatening the entire world. And while I can't say it made for a groundbreaking episode, I was pleasantly surprised. Yes, suburbs have a problem with racism. A fucking massive one that shouldn't be understated. Suburbs represent an unfair and unjust system, forcing people of color away from opportunities to not only better their own lives, but the lives of their entire family line from now to forever. It's fucked up, and it's a massive issue, but one that now that the prices of suburbs are going down, and the middle class is thinning, is beginning to break apart as more people of color can move in and reap the benefits, and even breathe new life into these places. One that is really the only major problem. Like I said earlier, for the most part, the issues with suburbs outside of that one is that they're dying and they're a waste of fucking space. Even the environmental impact isn't as big as whatever 5 corporations you want to pull out of the hat this week. Really, a lot of the issues with suburbs can really be fixed by 24 people decided they really give a shit, or us poors, Gen Z, queers, and people of color deciding to buy cheap property and ignore the stigma that comes with the idea of living in a suburb. Because face it, if you aren't in the city proper, you can make an argument that you already live in one. So just nut up and accept that your friends are going to make fun of you for being your average middle-class schlub. Just remember who they're going to ask when they want to have a barbecue. Episode that is surprisingly more hopeful than we've had in a while. What do you think of that? Let's go to the end. You feel that? A feeling of contentment? Like the entire world isn't caving in? Like we have a way to address our problems? Man, that's nice for once. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, personal issues we have with the suburbs and how to make them better, videos of you giving your boomer neighbors that ruin it for everyone the double bird brown eye, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. Remember, that is waytatpods@gmail.com. Remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat Nerd, where I do basically the same thing, but with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc. Mostly actually writing advice, where I hope you'll like the topics just as much. And also, remember to follow me on Twitter or Mastodon at waytat_pods for more episode announcements and some rants. Have a good night, don't murder, have fun, and remember, everywhere's a suburb if you're dumb enough. This has been Why Are You Talking About This? I've been your host, William. Good night.